My name is Nora Elaine Calloway. I am 38 years old. And for 6 weeks after my father was admitted to Beaufort Memorial Hospital, I believed my older sister Dana was just trying to help. I need to stop right there, because that is the wrong place to start and I already know it. That is the version I told myself for 6 weeks and it was not the truth, and if I start there I am going to spend the next hour building a story on a foundation that was already cracked. So let me go back. Let me go back to the actual beginning, which is not the hospital and not the deed and not the county recorder's office. The actual beginning is a Tuesday afternoon in March of 2019 when I was sitting in my office at Palmetto Title Solutions on Carteret Street in Beaufort, South Carolina, and my phone rang, and it was my father's neighbor, a woman named Loretta Sims who had lived 2 houses down from my parents since 1988. And she said, "Nora, I don't want to get in your family's business, but I think you need to know something." She said it just like that, quietly, with that particular carefulness that people use when they have been sitting on something for longer than they are comfortable with. I said, "Okay, Loretta, tell me." She said she had seen Dana's car in the driveway of my father's house 4 times in the past 2 weeks. She said she would not have thought anything of it except that each time Dana was there for more than 2 hours and she always left carrying something, a box once, a folder another time. And Loretta said she asked my father about it the next morning, casual, like neighbors do, and my father said, "Oh, Dana is just helping me organize some things." And Loretta said she did not say anything else to him because it was not her place. But she said she felt something was not right and she thought I should know. I thanked her, I set the phone down on my desk. And I sat there for a moment with my hands flat on my keyboard and I thought, Dana is organized. Dana is helpful. Dana has always been the one who shows up when there is something practical to be done. That is who she is. That is what she does. That is the story I had been telling myself about my sister for 38 years. I picked the phone back up and called my father. He sounded fine. He said Dana had been helping him go through some of the paperwork in his study because things had gotten a little overwhelming since my mother passed 2 years earlier, and he just wanted to feel like he had a handle on things. He said it like that, a handle on things. My father was 71 years old and he had been a high school history teacher for 32 years, and he was one of the most methodical people I have ever known. He had a filing system for his filing system. He did not need help getting a handle on things. But I said, "Okay, Daddy, that makes sense." Because that is what I did then. I said things that made sense on the surface and I did not dig underneath them. I am telling you that now because I want you to understand that I was not some naive person who could not see what was in front of her. I was a person who had spent 15 years working in title, reading legal descriptions, catching errors in recorded documents, finding discrepancies that attorneys missed. I was good at my job, I was precise. And I still missed it for a while because it was my family, and families have a particular kind of gravity that pulls your professional judgment sideways if you're not careful. So that was March of 2019. Let me jump forward. Just for a second, I want to show you something and then I will come back. It is September of 2019, 6 months later. I am standing in the Beaufort County Register of Deeds office on Ribout Road, and I am holding a copy of a recorded deed transfer for the parcel at 114 Moss Creek Lane, Beaufort, South Carolina, which is my father's property, which has been in our family since 1974. And the deed shows that ownership of that property was transferred by warranty deed from James Harold Calloway, sole owner, to Dana Michelle Calloway Prout on August the 9th, 2019. 12 days after my father was admitted to Beaufort Memorial with a cardiac event. 12 days after he went into the hospital, and I drove down from Columbia and sat with him in the ICU and held his hand while they ran tests, and I did not sleep for 2 nights straight. I am holding this piece of paper, and the woman behind the counter, whose name is Patricia and who I have known professionally for 6 years, is looking at me with an expression I cannot fully describe. It is not pity exactly. It is more like she is watching something happen that she cannot stop, and she knows it and I know it, and neither of us says anything for a long moment. I said, "Patricia, when did this come in?" She said it was recorded on August 11th. I said, "In person or by mail?" She said in person. She said she was not the one who processed it, it was her colleague James, but she saw the woman who brought it in. She described Dana without me asking. Dark hair pulled back, about 5'6", drove a silver Subaru. I said, "Thank you, Patricia." And I walked out to my car and sat there with the engine off and the window down and the September heat coming in off the marsh, and I did not cry and I did not call anyone. I just sat there and I thought, okay, Nora, let's go back to the beginning and do this right. So let me do that. Let me go back. all the way back to the beginning, the real one, and I will try not to jump ahead again even though there are places in this story where I already know what is coming, and it is very hard to tell it slowly when you know where it ends. My father's name is James Calloway. He was born in 1948 in Beaufort County, South Carolina, the second of three children. His parents, my grandparents, owned a piece of land on Moss Creek Lane that his father had bought in 1954 for $11,000, which even then was not a lot of money for 4.5 acres of low country land with marsh access. My grandfather built the house himself over 2 summers. 3 bedrooms, a screened porch, a dock that needed repairing every few years because the salt water took everything eventually. My grandfather died in 1991. My grandmother died in 2008. My father inherited the property outright, no mortgage, no liens, and his 2 siblings, both older, had already been compensated through other assets of the estate decades earlier. The property was his, clean and clear. By 2019, the land alone was appraised at $420,000. The house added another 130. Beaufort had changed. The whole Low Country had changed. People had discovered it, and the prices had followed. My father knew this. He was not confused about what he had. He talked about the property the way people talk about something they intend to protect. He used to say that land stays in this family, and he meant it the way people mean things they have thought about carefully over a long time. My mother, Elaine, died in February of 2017. Ovarian cancer, diagnosed in October, gone by February. It was fast and it was terrible, and it left my father in a house that had been built for someone else's family size, in a town he had lived in his whole life, surrounded by people who remembered Elaine the way you remember someone who was exactly where she was supposed to be. My father grieved slowly. He was not a man who fell apart in public. He kept his yard, he kept his appointments, he had dinner every Sunday with whoever would come. Dana went down to Beaufort more than I did in those 2 years after our mother died. That is just true, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. I was living in Columbia, 2 hours away, and I had a caseload and a daughter in middle school and a house that needed its own constant attention. Dana lived in Bluffton, 40 minutes from my father. She was there more. She helped more with the practical things. I knew that, and I was grateful for it, and I told her so. What I did not know then was what being there more looked like from the inside. In January of 2019, 2 months before Loretta called me, my father called me on a Sunday afternoon. He said he had been doing some thinking about the property and he wanted to make sure his affairs were in order. He said he had been looking into putting together a will, a formal one with an attorney, and he wanted to know if I would be involved in that conversation. I said, of course. He said he was going to reach out to a lawyer named Robert Finch in Beaufort that a friend had recommended, and he would let me know when he had an appointment set. That appointment never happened, or rather, it happened differently than my father described. I found that out much later, but I want to stay in January for a moment because there is something else. My father mentioned on that same call that Dana had suggested he think about putting the property in her name. For ease of transfer, she had called it, so that if anything happened to him, there would not be any delays or complications. And he said it to me in the same tone he used when he was describing a school board meeting he disagreed with, which was the tone of a man who had already decided something but wanted to say it out loud to someone he trusted before he closed the door on it. I said, Daddy, that is not what wills are for. That is what wills are for, to handle exactly that. You do not need to put the property in Dana's name for anything to transfer smoothly. He said, I know, that's what I thought. And then we talked about something else. I thought that was the end of it. Can I ask you something? Have you ever had a moment where someone said exactly the right thing back to you and you believed them and you moved on, and then 3 months later you found out they said the same right thing to someone else too and then did a completely different thing entirely? Because that is what happened here. My father said, I know, that is what I thought. And he meant it when he said it. I believe that completely, he meant it. But Dana was in Beaufort, 40 minutes away, and I was in Columbia, 2 hours away. And time and proximity do things to people, especially people who are grieving and 71 years old and not sleeping well and eating cereal for dinner 3 nights a week because cooking for one felt pointless. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories. This is where we share real-life inspired tales of family conflict, betrayal, and the quiet strength it takes to stand your ground. If these stories speak to you, drop a comment and be sure to subscribe. Let me tell you about the week of August the 1st. Actually, no, I need to back up one more time. I keep saying that and I know it is maddening, but this is a story that does not move in a straight line because I did not live it in a straight line. I lived it the way you live something that is happening to you while you are doing other things, in the margins, in the corners, in the phone calls you almost do not make. So, April of 2019, 1 month after Loretta's call, I drove down to Beaufort on a Saturday. I told my father I was coming to take him to lunch and to help him clean out the gutters, which needed doing. Both of those things were true. I also wanted to see the house with my own eyes, and I wanted to see my father face to face because there are things you can hear in a voice on the phone, and there are things you can only see. We had lunch at Luther's Rare and Well Done on Bay Street. My father ordered the fried shrimp plate. He ate most of it. He looked tired but not unwell. He looked like a man who was used to being quieter than he used to be. After lunch, we went back to the house. I cleaned the gutters. He sat on the porch and watched, and we talked about nothing in particular: the neighbors, a book he was reading about the Civil War in the Sea Islands, the fact that the Blue Heron had been coming back to the dock every morning at the same time for the past 3 weeks. My father called the heron Gerald. He said Gerald seemed to be doing well. At some point in the late afternoon, I said I needed to use the bathroom, and I went inside and I walked through the kitchen and the hallway, and I stood at the door of my father's study for a moment. The study was a room that had always looked a certain way. My father had a specific system for his papers. He had a standing file cabinet, 4 drawers with colored hanging folders labeled in his handwriting. He had a desktop organizer with slots for current bills, paid bills, pending correspondence. He had a wooden inbox tray that had sat on the corner of his desk since I was a child, dark walnut, small brass handle on the front. When we were young, Dana and I used to pretend it was a treasure chest. The filing cabinet was still there, the organizer was still there, the inbox tray was still there. But the top 2 drawers of the filing cabinet were both fully open, not pulled out all the way, just open a few inches each, the way a drawer looks when someone has been going through it and was interrupted and forgot to push it closed. My father was outside on the porch, I was alone in the study. I stood there and I thought that could be anything. He could have been looking for something this morning, he could have left them open himself. I pushed both drawers closed, I went to the bathroom, I went back to the porch. I did not say anything. I drove back to Columbia that evening and I spent the 3 hours on I-26 running a very quiet internal argument with myself about whether I was seeing things that were not there. About whether working in title for 15 years had made me professionally paranoid in a way that was bleeding into my personal life. About whether I was the kind of daughter who drove 2 hours to check on her father because she loved him, or the kind who drove 2 hours because she did not trust her sister. I did not have an answer that satisfied me. In May, I called Robert Finch's office, the attorney my father had mentioned. I said I was James Calloway's daughter and I was calling to follow up on an appointment he had mentioned setting earlier in the year. The receptionist put me on hold for a moment and came back and said they did not have a James Calloway in their system. I said, "Are you sure?" She said yes. She said she would check again. She came back and said, "I am sorry, there is no record of a James Calloway as a client here." I thanked her and hung up. And then I called my father and asked him casually, like it was a passing thought, whether he had gotten around to meeting with that attorney he had mentioned. And my father said, "Oh yes." He said he had gone in February and it was a very straightforward conversation and he felt good about where things stood. I said, "That's great, Daddy. Who did he end up using?" He said, "Robert Finch over on Carteret." I said, "Good choice. I've heard good things about him." I said that, "Good choice, I've heard good things about him." And my stomach had gone somewhere underneath my ribcage and was sitting there very still and very heavy, but I kept my voice level because I needed to know what my father believed was true before I started challenging it. I called Robert Finch's office 2 more times over the next 3 weeks. Different days, different times. Neither time was a James Calloway in their system. Which meant one of two things. Either my father had misremembered the attorney's name or my father had never actually gone. I want to tell you that I immediately called Dana and confronted her. I want to tell you that I was that decisive, that I moved fast, that I caught it early, but that is not what happened. What happened is that I was still trying to be fair, still trying to give everyone, including my sister, the benefit of what was not yet proven. I was still in the part of the story where I was collecting information quietly because I had been trained professionally to collect information before I drew conclusions. That is the honest truth of it, and I am not proud of all of it, but it is what happened. June passed, my father seemed stable. Dana called me twice that summer, normal calls: "How is your daughter? How is work? Isn't this heat something?" She did not mention the property, she did not mention attorneys. She sounded like my sister, which she was, which is the thing about people who know you well and have been watching you your whole life. They know exactly how to sound. My daughter Becca turned 13 in July. My father came up to Columbia for the birthday dinner. He brought her a book about South Carolina wildlife that she pretended to love and will probably actually read someday because she is her grandfather's granddaughter in ways she does not know yet. He looked well that evening. He ate 2 pieces of cake. He drove home the next morning. 3 weeks later, on July the 20th, 2019, my father called me at 7 in the morning. He said he had woken up with chest pain and he had driven himself to the emergency room at Beaufort Memorial because he did not want to call Dana at that hour and bother her. He said it in that way my father said things, as if his own cardiac event was an inconvenience he was apologizing for. I was in the car within 20 minutes. He was admitted that day, atrial fibrillation with some additional concerns the cardiologist wanted to monitor. He was not in immediate danger, but they wanted to observe him, run some tests, adjust his medications. They were talking about keeping him at least a week, possibly longer. I called Dana from the hospital parking lot. She said she would come that afternoon. She said, "Do not worry, I will help manage things." I said, "Okay, thank you, Dana." And I went back inside and I sat with my father and I helped him eat his lunch because he was irritated by the IV in his right hand, and I did not leave until 9 that night. Dana arrived the next morning. She was organized as always. She had a tote bag. She brought my father's reading glasses from his nightstand because he had forgotten them in his rush to leave, and she brought a biography he had been in the middle of, and she brought a small pillow from his bed because she knows he cannot sleep on hospital pillows. These are the things Dana does. She shows up with the right things. She anticipates. She has always been good at that. I went home to Columbia for 2 nights to be with Becca and to work, and I came back down on the weekend. My father was improving. He was sitting up, complaining about the food, which was a good sign. Dana had been there every day. I was grateful. I am going to tell you something that I keep coming back to, and I still do not have a clean way to feel about it. On that Saturday, my father's second weekend in the hospital, Dana and I sat together in the waiting area outside his room while they did an echocardiogram. We got coffee from the machine down the hall. Bad coffee, the kind that tastes like it went to sleep 2 hours ago and never woke up. And we sat there and we talked about our father and about how neither of us had said enough of the things we should have said to our mother before she died, and about how this was making us both think about time differently. Dana cried a little, real tears. I believe they were real. I am telling you that because I do not want to make her into something simple, and I do not want to make myself into something that never doubted what it was seeing. I came back to Beaufort the following Wednesday, August the 7th. My father was being discharged the next day, and I wanted to help get the house ready, make sure there was food in the refrigerator, check that his prescriptions were called in. Dana had been staying in a hotel 2 miles from the hospital, something she had set up the first week, which made sense because she did not have a key to my father's house. I want to stop there. She did not have a key to my father's house. I had a key. I have had a key since I was 22 years old and moved to Columbia for the first time, and my father gave me a copy in case of emergencies. Dana did not have one. This is not a significant detail on its own. Lots of people do not have keys to their parents' houses, but I am telling you because it becomes something later. I let myself in on Wednesday afternoon. I cleaned, I shopped, I organized his medications on the kitchen counter with a paper that told him what to take when. I aired out the house. I changed the sheets on his bed. While I was in the study getting the extra fan he kept in the closet, I noticed that the top right drawer of the filing cabinet was open again. Same as April, open a few inches. I stood there for a moment and I thought about April and the thought I had in April about whether I was seeing things that were not there. And then I crossed the room and I opened the drawer fully. The hanging folders were all there, labeled in his handwriting. Bills, insurance, tax returns, medical correspondence, property, but the property folder was thinner than I remembered. And when I flipped through it, there were folders for the car insurance, the homeowner's insurance, the flood insurance. There was a folder for the property tax receipts going back to 2009. There was no original deed. I want to be precise about what I mean when I say original deed. My father had lived in that house since 1974. He had a copy of his parents' original 1954 purchase deed. He had the deed from when his parents transferred the property to him in 1989 while they were still living as an estate planning move. He had always kept these in the property folder. I had seen them there myself years ago when I was helping him organize the study after my mother's diagnosis. They were not there. I went through every other folder in the cabinet. I went through the inbox tray. I went through the two drawers of the desk itself, carefully, methodically, not disturbing anything more than I had to. In the bottom right drawer of the desk, under a folded AAA road map of South Carolina that had been there since probably 1995, I found a white envelope, unsealed. My father's handwriting on the front, not addressed to anyone, just one word, Nora. Inside was the original 1989 deed, the one that showed the property transferring from my grandparents to my father, and there was a handwritten note on a piece of yellow legal paper in my father's handwriting, and it said, in full, Nora, I do not know what is in the folder upstairs. Dana brought me some papers to sign last week and I signed them. I was tired and she said it was just updating the insurance and I signed. I found this deed in my study this morning after she left. I do not know where she put it before. I am not sure what I signed. Do not say anything to her yet. I put this here for you. The note was dated July 12, 2019, 8 days before my father went to the hospital. I sat down on the floor of his study with my back against the desk, and I held that envelope in both hands and I did not move for a very long time. The ceiling fan was turning slowly overhead and the afternoon light was coming in through the window at an angle that put a long bar of gold across the floor, and I watched that bar of light move while I thought about every conversation I had had with my father in the past 6 months, every reassurance I had accepted, everything I had chosen not to press. And I thought he knew. He knew something was wrong and he could not quite say it out loud, but he knew. And he left this for me the way you leave something for someone when you are not sure you will be able to say it directly, when you are not sure the moment will come, when you are not sure your own certainty will hold. He put this here for me 8 days before he went into the hospital, which meant that while he was in that hospital for 3 weeks, this note was sitting in this drawer, waiting, and I had been in this house twice and I had not known to look. My stomach dropped and stayed there. It did not come back up for a long time. I took the envelope. I locked the study. I went and finished making his bed and I went home to my own hotel room and I sat at the small desk by the window and I read the note 6 more times and then I put it back in the envelope and I put the envelope in the zipper pocket of my laptop bag and I slept for 4 hours and I woke up at 5 in the morning and I lay there in the dark and I made a decision about how I was going to handle what came next. I did not call Dana. I did not confront her. I went to the hospital the next morning and I helped my father come home and I made him breakfast and I sat with him on the porch and we watched Gerald on the dock for a while. Dana came by in the afternoon with a casserole. I was pleasant. I talked about Becca. I did not look at my sister any differently than I normally would, or at least I tried not to. Whether I succeeded, I cannot say. The day after my father came home, I drove to the Beaufort County Register of Deeds office on Ribout Road. It was a Thursday morning in August, the air already thick and close at 9 o'clock. I parked in the lot on the side and I went in and I asked Patricia at the front desk if I could pull the recorded documents for parcel number 250,000,042, which is 114 Moss Creek Lane. She pulled it up and printed it for me without asking any questions, because I had been doing this professionally for 15 years, and we both knew exactly how to do this. And that is when I saw it. The warranty deed dated August 9th, 2019, transferring ownership from James Harold Calloway to Dana Michelle Calloway Prout, recorded August 11th. Which meant it was signed on August 9th, which was my father's third day in the hospital. I am going to tell you what I first thought when I saw that date. I thought maybe he agreed to it. Maybe he decided while he was in the hospital, scared and tired and facing his own mortality, that he wanted to simplify things and Dana was there and he made a decision. That is the version I gave myself first because I had been giving my family generous versions of things for a long time and the habit was deeply ingrained. Then I thought about the note. July 12th, I do not know what I signed. I was tired and she said it was just updating the insurance and I signed. And I thought about a man who was already worried before he went into the hospital, who had already hidden a deed in a drawer with a note for his daughter, who had already sensed that something was wrong, signing another document in his hospital bed 3 days into a cardiac event. And then I stopped giving anyone a generous version. Tell me something if you found out that someone you trusted had been quietly moving pieces into position for months, and you had been watching without quite seeing, and you had a note in your bag that proved your father had been worried. How long would it take you to know what you needed to do next? Because for me, it was not long. It was the length of time it took to walk from Patricia's desk back to my car, which was maybe 90 steps on a Thursday morning in August in Beaufort, South Carolina. Tell me in the comments. I read every single one, And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the time because what happens next is the part I've been building toward this whole time. I need to back up one more time. There is one more thing I missed in the original version I was telling myself, and I want to put it in the right place before I go forward. Robert Finch. I had called his office 3 times and gotten no record of my father as a client, but I had not gone in person. I had not asked the specific question I now knew to ask. So on the Friday after I pulled the deed, I drove to Robert Finch's office on Carteret Street, which is 3 blocks from my own office, and I asked the receptionist whether they had ever had a client named James Calloway. Not current client, ever. She said she would need to check with Mr. Finch about that. Mr. Finch came out himself. He was in his 60s, gray hair, the kind of careful face that attorneys get after 20 years of not reacting visibly to anything. He said he remembered James Calloway. He said my father had come in February with his daughter. He said they had a conversation about estate planning and the daughter had done most of the talking. He said he had some concerns about the meeting that he was not going to specify, but he said that he had ultimately declined to take my father on as a client because he did not feel the circumstances were appropriate for him to proceed. I said which daughter came with him. He looked at me for a moment and I could see him deciding something. He said the daughter who came with your father had dark hair and drove a silver Subaru. I said thank you, Mr. Finch. He said, I hope things work out for your family, Ms. Calloway. He said it like a man who had seen this before and found it as exhausting as it was. So the true version of the February attorney visit was this. Dana had taken my father to Robert Finch, had done most of the talking, and Finch had declined to declined to proceed. In my experience, and I have a fair amount of it, attorneys who decline to proceed in estate matters are usually declining because someone in the room does not appear to be acting freely. They do not say that. They cannot always say that, but they decline. My father had then told me he had gone to see a lawyer and everything was fine. He believed that was what had happened because Dana had told him it was what had happened, or he was confused, or he was trying to tell me something and could not find the words. I still do not know which of those it was. I think it might be all three at once. I went back to my office on Carteret Street and I sat at my desk and I opened my laptop and I started building a file. Here is what I want to tell you about building a file when you work in title and you suspect something has happened to a deed in your own family's property. It is surreal. It is the most surreal professional experience I have had in 15 years, and I have seen some things. It is the experience of being very good at your job and wishing desperately that your job had no application to your current circumstances. I know exactly what to look for. I know exactly what a fraudulent transfer looks like. I know the specific ways that signatures get forged, the ways that dates get manipulated, the ways that a document can be made to look legitimate while being entirely wrong. I pulled the full title chain on 114 Moss Creek Lane going back to 1954. I printed every recorded document. I laid them out on my desk chronologically. The 1954 purchase, the 1989 transfer from my grandparents to my father, the 2019 transfer from my father to Dana. Then I pulled my father's signature from every other document in the chain. His signature on the 1989 transfer, which I had the original of in my laptop bag. His signature on a 2015 property tax appeal he had filed. His signature on a 2013 homeowner's insurance claim. And I put the 2019 deed next to all of them, and I looked at the signature on the 2019 deed. I want to be careful here about what I say and how I say it because this became a legal matter and there are things that were established in that legal process that I can tell you and things I am going to be careful about. What I can tell you is that when I laid those signatures side by side, the signature on the 2019 deed was different in ways that I, as a trained professional, found significant. The baseline wandered in a way I would not expect from my father's normal signature. The capital J in James was formed differently than his usual habit. The pressure was lighter and more uneven than I would expect from a man who had been signing his name the same way for 40 years. There is also the matter of August 9th. My father was 3 days into a hospital stay for a cardiac event. He was on new medications that had not yet been adjusted to the right levels. He had not slept well in days. He was scared, though he would never say so. I called an attorney named Cynthia Wash, who practices elder law and estate litigation out of Columbia and who had been recommended to me by a colleague. I said, I have a situation. I told her what I had. The note, The timeline, the deed, the Robert Finch conversation, the signature comparison. She was quiet for a moment and then she said, I am going to need copies of everything you just described. She said, do not say anything to your sister yet. She said, get me your father's written authorization to represent his interests, and she told me exactly how to do that. I drove to my father's house that afternoon with a simple letter of authorization that Cynthia had emailed me. I sat with my father on the porch. Gerald was on the dock. The late afternoon light was doing what it does in the low country in August, going gold and then going orange and then softening into something that makes you understand why people never leave. I said, Daddy, I need to talk to you about something and I need you to listen to the whole thing before you say anything. He looked at me. He had his hands on the arms of the porch chair, the old wooden one with the peeling paint that he had been meaning to repaint for 6 years. He did not say anything. He just waited. I told him what I had found, the deed, the dates, the signature, Finch's office. I told him slowly and without drama, and I watched his face while I told him. He did not look surprised. He looked like a man hearing something confirmed that he had suspected and had been afraid was true. When I finished, he was quiet for a while. Gerald left the dock and flew off somewhere over the marsh, and we watched him go. My father said, I do not know what she gave me to sign in that hospital. I told her I was too tired. She said it was just a form for the utilities to make sure the bills kept getting paid while I was out. She had a pen out before I finished reading the first lines. He said it without anger. He said it the way he said things he was ashamed of, which was very quietly and with his eyes on the middle distance. I said, Daddy, this is not your fault. He said, I should have called you first. I said, you left me the note. He said, I wasn't sure you would find it. I said, I found it. He signed the authorization letter, and I took it back to Columbia that night, and I sent it to Cynthia Wash before I went to bed. What happened over the next several months was a legal process, and I am going to tell you what I can of it, and I am going to be honest about the parts that were hard, because they were hard. Cynthia filed a complaint with the Beaufort County Probate Court challenging the validity of the August 2019 deed transfer. The basis was threefold: lack of capacity, undue influence, and potential fraud. My father was a cooperative and clear witness in his own behalf, which mattered. His cardiologist provided records and a statement about his condition on August 9th. The medications he had been given in the first days of his hospital stay, and their known effects on cognitive function and susceptibility to suggestion, were part of that record. Robert Finch agreed to provide an affidavit about the February visit. He was precise and careful in it. He said he had declined to proceed as counsel because he observed that the patient, James Calloway, appeared to be acting under significant influence from the family member present and did not appear to be expressing his own independent wishes about his estate. He said that the family member had answered questions directed at Mr. Calloway on multiple occasions. He said that at one point, Mr. Calloway had looked at the family member before answering a direct question from Mr. Finch. He said he had seen this pattern before, and he did not find it appropriate to continue the representation. Finch's affidavit was, in Cynthia's words, extraordinarily helpful. I also hired a forensic document examiner named Dr. Patricia Wren, out of Charleston, who had testified in over 60 court cases involving questioned documents. She examined the 2019 deed signature and compared it against 12 authenticated samples of my father's signature from documents spanning 20 years. Her conclusion, in technical terms that I will translate: the signature on the 2019 deed showed characteristics inconsistent with the authenticated samples and consistent with a signature produced under significantly compromised physical or cognitive conditions. She stopped short of calling it a forgery in the sense of someone else's hand producing it. She said it was a signature that could not be verified as freely and capably given. Dana hired her own attorney, a man named Gerard Pelham out of Bluffton. I know his name because it was on every piece of correspondence. He was not a bad attorney. He made the arguments he could make. He said my father had signed the deed of his own will. He said my father had mental capacity. He said the difference in the signature was explained by the medical circumstances and did not indicate anything improper. He said Dana had only been trying to help manage the family's affairs in a time of crisis. There were 2 court appearances. The first was procedural motions scheduling the usual framework of litigation. The second was the hearing where evidence was presented. My father testified for 40 minutes. He was 71 years old and he sat in that witness chair in a Beaufort courtroom and he told the truth the way he had always told things, plainly and without decoration. He said he did not know what he was signing. He said he was tired and scared and he trusted his daughter. He said he found the original deed on his floor the next morning after she had been in his study, which was a detail I had not known before that hearing, and it told me something about the day she took it that I will not say out loud here. The court ruled in November of 2019. The August 2019 deed transfer was voided. Ownership of 114 Moss Creek Lane, Beaufort, South Carolina, was restored to James Harold Calloway in full. The court found that the execution of the deed was not the product of his free and informed consent. Dana did not attend the second hearing. She sent Pelham in her place. I have not spoken to her since September of 2019, the morning I called her and told her I had found the deed and I had spoken to an attorney and she should do the same. She said I was making accusations. I said I was telling her what I had found. She said I had always been jealous of her relationship with our father. I said, Dana, I will talk to you again when this is resolved, and I have not talked to her since. I do not know if that will ever change. I do not know if I want it to. I am not going to tell you that. I have made peace with it because I have not entirely. There is a thing that happens when you realize that someone you grew up with, who shared a bedroom with you for the first 12 years of your life, who you called when your marriage ended and when your daughter was born, has been moving pieces around a board that you did not know you were sitting at. It does not resolve into something clean. It sits in a complicated place in your chest and you learn to move around it. My father is still at 114 Moss Creek Lane. He will be 75 this spring. He replaced the dock last summer, paid for it himself, did not ask either of his daughters for anything. He has a new chair on the porch painted blue. Gerald still comes to the dock, or a heron that my father has decided is Gerald, which for his purposes is the same thing. I drove down in November, the week after the court ruling. I had dinner with him. He made rice and beans from a recipe my mother used to make, and he got it almost right, close enough that neither of us said anything about the ways it was different. After dinner, we sat on the porch in the cold and he said, I should have called you the first time Dana mentioned the property. I said, you left me the note. He said, you always were the one who paid attention. I did not say what I was thinking, which was that paying attention was not enough, that there was a version of this where I paid attention sooner and the hearing was not necessary and the deed was never recorded and we never sat in a Beaufort courtroom watching my father describe the morning he found his own deed on the floor of his study. That version existed. I just was not the one who lived it. I drove home to Columbia that night on I-26 with the heat on low and the radio off. The original 1989 deed was in my laptop bag in the back seat, where I had been keeping it since August. Cynthia had suggested I hold onto it as a working copy until the court ruling was finalized and the county records were corrected, and I had, and now there was no more reason to carry it. But I did not take it out of the bag that night. I left it there. I think I was not quite ready to put it down. My name is Nora Elaine Calloway. I am 38 years old, and I have a key to my father's house, and so does he, and that is all that needs to be said about that. There is something I did not tell you about that Saturday in April, the one where I drove down to clean the gutters and I found the filing cabinet drawers open. I told you I pushed the drawers closed and went back to the porch. I told you I drove home to Columbia and spent 3 hours on I-26 arguing with myself about whether I was being professionally paranoid. What I did not tell you is that before I went back to the porch, I stood in my father's study for a full 4 minutes. I know it was 4 minutes because the clock on his wall is an old regulator clock that he winds every Sunday, and it has a loud tick, and I counted ticks while I stood there with my hand still on the top drawer of the filing cabinet. The study had a particular smell, old paper and cedar and the specific dry quality of a room that gets afternoon sun through west-facing windows. My father had lived in that smell for 50 years, since before I was born, and I had grown up breathing it on Sunday afternoons when he was grading papers at that desk, and it was so familiar to me that normally I did not notice it. But I noticed it that day because I was standing very still paying attention to everything in the room, the way you pay attention to things when you suspect something but cannot name it yet. The desktop was neat. The inbox tray had 3 envelopes in it, which was normal for a man who still received paper mail and sorted it regularly. The desktop organizer had its labeled slots, all filled in their expected proportions. The lamp was turned off. The chair was pushed in at a precise angle that I recognized as my father's habitual angle, not pushed all the way in but at a slight offset because he had a habit of turning it 3/4 of the way in and then stopping. Everything looked exactly right, which was somehow more unsettling than if something had looked obviously wrong. I thought about that for a while driving home, about how something can look exactly right and still feel wrong. about how that feeling is not paranoia, about how in 15 years of title work I had looked at documents that looked exactly right and had learned to feel the wrongness before I could name it, and about how that feeling was almost always pointing at something real. But feeling is not evidence, and I was trying to be fair. I called my father 3 times in May. He sounded fine each time. He was reading the Civil War book. He had started going back to his Thursday morning coffee group at the diner on Bay Street, a group of retired men who had been meeting there since the late 1990s and who talked about baseball and local politics and whether the traffic on the bridge was getting worse, which it always was. He said Gerald had brought a second heron to the dock, younger one, and he was not sure Gerald approved, but he was tolerating it. My father told stories like that, small, careful observations about the world immediately around him. He had always been like that. He noticed things at close range and he trusted them. It was one of the things I loved about him, and also in this situation, one of the things that made me afraid for him. Because someone who trusts what is immediately in front of him is someone who can be managed by controlling what is immediately in front of him. Dana understood that about him. She had grown up with him too. She knew how he thought and what he trusted and how he processed things. I do not say that to be uncharitable, I say it because it is relevant. Knowing someone well is not inherently a manipulation, but knowing someone well and using that knowledge to position yourself in their immediate trust while creating distance from others, that is something different. I did not have the word for what she was doing then. I had the feeling and the incomplete evidence and the professional instinct. I did not yet have the full picture. Let me tell you about the summer. The summer between Loretta's call and my father's hospitalization, which is the summer where I was living my normal life in Colombia while things were happening in Beaufort that I could not see. Becca finished 7th grade in June. She had a complicated year, the way 7th grade is for almost everyone, and I spent a lot of that spring focused on her friendships and her schoolwork and the particular kind of turbulence that 13 brings. My job was busy. We had a backlog of closings, and our title examiner had been out for 3 weeks with a knee surgery, and I was covering extra work on top of my own. I was not sleeping well. I called my father every Sunday without fail. That was our tradition, had been since I moved to Columbia at 22. Sunday evening after dinner, sometimes for 5 minutes and sometimes for an hour, he always answered. In June, he mentioned casually that he had been thinking about the property again, not in any alarming way, he said, just thinking about the long term. He said he had looked into what was called a life estate deed, which would let him stay in the house as long as he lived but transfer ownership at his death without going through probate. He said he thought it might be a simpler way to handle things. Now, a life estate deed is a legitimate estate planning tool. It is also something that can be set up improperly or under pressure, and it is something that, once recorded, significantly changes who controls a property. As someone who works in title, I know what life estate deeds look like and what they do and how they are sometimes used in ways that are not in the grantor's best interest. I said that's worth looking into. I said, have you talked to an attorney about it? He said Dana had found some information about it and they had been looking it over. I said, Daddy, before you do anything with the property, please talk to an attorney on your own. Not with Dana, not with me, but by yourself, so that you can ask whatever questions you want without anyone else in the room. He said, that's a good idea, Nora. That was June. He did not, as far as I can determine, ever speak to an attorney by himself. The closest he came was the February visit to Robert Finch, which Dana attended and which Finch declined to continue, and I did not find out about that visit until September. The thing about this story that is hardest to tell is the time, how long it took. How much happened in the ordinary time between the markers, the calls that seemed normal, the Sunday evenings, the birthday dinner in July, my father coming up to Columbia with the wildlife book and eating 2 pieces of cake. All of that was real. All of that was also happening at the same time as whatever Dana was doing in Beaufort on weekday afternoons when I was not there. Time does not pause for the part of the story you are not watching. I have thought about this a lot since 2019, about the architecture of it. Dana was not, as far as I know, staying up late devising schemes. I do not think she sat down one evening and drew up a plan. I think it was more like she saw something available to her and she moved toward it incrementally, each step small enough to seem like nothing, and the increments added up over 18 months into something that required a legal proceeding to undo. I think she convinced herself at some point that she was doing the right thing, or at least the reasonable thing. I think she told herself a version of events in which she was the responsible one, the one who showed up, the one who handled things, and in which some proportionate reward for that was not only fair but sensible. I think she may have genuinely believed some version of this. I am not sure that makes it better, but I think it is true. After the court ruling in November, one of the things I did was sit down with my father and go through his study with him, the full study, every drawer, every folder, every document, not because I suspected anything remaining, but because I wanted him to know exactly what he had and where it was. I made a complete inventory. We put everything back in a reorganized filing system with new labels. I made copies of the important documents, the deed, the property tax records, the insurance policies, and I put the copies in a folder at my office on Carteret Street. My father watched me do all of this with an expression that was somewhere between grateful and pained. At one point he said, "I feel like a child whose room is being organized by his parents." And I said, "You feel that way because I am doing exactly that," and he laughed a little, and the laugh loosened something in the room that had been tight for a while. There is a moment in that inventory afternoon that I want to tell you about. We were going through the bottom right drawer of the desk, the same drawer where I found the note in August, and at the very back of the drawer, tucked behind the AAA roadmap that was still there, was a small index card, my father's handwriting, a list of 6 names. His 2 daughters, his sister in Georgia, 2 friends, a colleague from the school where he had taught. Under each name was a phone number. He had written emergency contacts at the top in blue ink. I held the index card and I looked at my own name and number written in my father's handwriting, and I thought about him writing this. About him sitting at this desk at some point before the hospital and before August, maybe before July, maybe much earlier, and deciding that he needed a list of people who could be reached in an emergency, and writing his daughters' names and numbers down. Putting the list in the back of the bottom drawer where it would not be obviously visible, but could be found by someone who went looking. I do not know when he wrote it. He did not remember when he wrote it. It could have been years ago, but it was in the same drawer as the note. And it had both my number and Dana's, equally listed, equally present. I thought about that for a long time, about the fact that in that drawer he had kept both of us. Whatever he suspected about Dana, whatever he was afraid of, he still wrote her number down on the emergency contacts card. She was still his daughter. He was still her father. Some of these things are true simultaneously and do not resolve into something easier. I put the index card back where I found it. I did not say anything to my father about it. I do not know if he saw me find it. If he did not mention it either. That is where it ended, not with a confrontation, not with a statement or a reckoning or a scene. It ended in a study in Beaufort, South Carolina on a Wednesday afternoon in November 2019 with an index card going back into a drawer and 2 people, a father and his daughter, going through papers and deciding quietly what to keep and what to reorganize and what to leave exactly where it was. My father still has both of our numbers on that card. I saw it again when I was there in March of this year. I did not move it. I did not take it out and look at it. I just saw it at the back of the drawer and I pushed the drawer closed and I went back to the kitchen where my father was making coffee and I sat down at the table and I told him Gerald was back on the dock. He said Gerald never left. He said it with the certainty of a man who has lived in one place long enough to know which parts of it remain constant. And maybe he was right. Maybe it was Gerald the whole time, every year the same heron, faithful to the same dock. Or maybe there were many herons across many years and my father had given them all one name because continuity is something we construct from the materials we have. I do not know. But I sat at his kitchen table with the coffee and the marsh and Gerald or Gerald's descendant on the dock, and I did not need to know. Some things you leave as they are, some things you leave the name on. My name is Nora Elaine Calloway. I am 38 years old. My father's property at 114 Moss Creek Lane, Beaufort, South Carolina is in his name and will remain in his name for as long as he is alive, and after that it will go where he decides it goes, to whoever he decides in whatever form he chooses, in a document prepared by a lawyer of his choosing in a room where he is the only client. I found the original deed in his desk. I kept it until I could put it back where it belongs. And every Sunday evening my phone rings at 7 o'clock and it is my father, steady as Gerald, steady as the dock, calling because that is what we do and that is what we have always done, and some things do not need to be complicated more than they already are. I want to go back one more time to the hearing itself, because I told you what the outcome was and I told you the evidentiary basis, and I told you that Dana sent her attorney in her place, but I did not tell you what it was like to sit in that room. The Beaufort County Courthouse is on Carteret Street, which in Beaufort is a street that runs along the waterfront, Spanish moss hanging from the oaks that line it, old houses with high piazzas and painted shutters, the kind of street that looks like a photograph of itself. The courthouse is a serious building on a beautiful street. And on a gray November morning in 2019, I parked in the lot off Bay Street, and I walked the 2 blocks to it, and I went inside, and I sat in a wooden chair in a hallway outside the courtroom, and I waited for my father. He arrived with Cynthia. He was wearing a dark blue jacket I had not seen before, pressed slacks, the same dress shoes he had worn to my mother's funeral. He had shaved carefully. He was carrying a manila folder. I said, "What's in the folder?" He said, "I don't know. Cynthia told me to carry it so I look like I have things in order." There was nothing in the folder. I found that out later. It was an empty manila folder from his study. Cynthia had told him it would help him feel settled to have something in his hands, and it did, or seemed to, because he walked into that courtroom with the folder and he sat down at the table and he set it in front of him and he straightened it once and then he did not touch it again. I sat in the gallery. Cynthia's paralegal sat next to me and answered my questions in a low voice when I had them, which was often, because even knowing what I know professionally, there is a difference between reading about legal proceedings and sitting in one that involves your father and your sister and a piece of land your grandfather built a house on in 1954. Gerard Pelham, Dana's attorney, sat at the other table alone. He had a briefcase and a laptop and a legal pad with notes on it in small, precise handwriting that I could see from 2 rows back. He was organized. He was prepared. He did not look at me. The judge was a woman named the Honorable Sandra Lott, who had been on the Beaufort County bench for 11 years. She was in her late 50s, reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and she had the particular economy of movement that long-serving judges develop: no wasted gesture, no unnecessary expression, just attention and procedure. The hearing lasted most of the morning. Cynthia presented the case methodically. The timeline, the note, the Robert Finch affidavit, Dr. Wren's forensic document analysis, my father's medical records from August of 2019, specifically the records from August 9th, the day the deed was signed, including his medication list and the nursing notes from that shift. One of those nursing notes, entered at 2:15 in the afternoon, said patient appeared fatigued and mildly confused during afternoon assessment, required repeated orientation to time and day. That nursing note was, in Cynthia's telling, one of the most important documents in the case, because August 9th was a Saturday. The deed was notarized at 3:45 in the afternoon, a Saturday afternoon in a hospital room. The nursing note was from 2:15, an hour and a half before the notarization. Pelham cross-examined my father. He was not aggressive, but he was thorough. He asked my father whether he remembered signing the document. My father said he remembered being asked to sign something. He said he did not remember being told it was a property transfer. He said Dana had said it was paperwork to make sure the utilities and the regular bills kept being paid while he was in the hospital, which was consistent with what he had told me in September. Pelham asked my father whether he trusted his daughter Dana. My father said, "I trusted everyone in my family." He said it in the past tense. I do not know if Pelham noticed. I did. Pelham asked my father whether it was possible he had understood what he was signing and simply did not remember now, given the time that had passed. My father said he supposed anything was possible. He said, "But I know what Dana told me, and I know that what she told me was not what the paper turned out to be." Cynthia's redirect was brief. She asked my father one question. She said, "Mr. Calloway, did you want to transfer the ownership of your property at 114 Moss Creek Lane to your daughter Dana?" My father said no. One word, he said it. And looked at the judge and then looked at the empty manila folder on the table in front of him and straightened it again, one small precise adjustment, and Cynthia said she had nothing further. Judge Lott did not take long to deliberate. She read into the record a summary of the evidence and issued her ruling from the bench, which Cynthia had told me she might do if the case was clear enough. She found that the execution of the August 2019 deed had not met the legal standard for a valid, voluntary conveyance. She cited the lack of independent legal counsel for the grantor, the medical circumstances at the time of signing, the evidence from Dr. Wren's forensic analysis, and the Robert Finch affidavit as the primary basis for her ruling. She voided the transfer and ordered the county records corrected to reflect ownership in James Harold Calloway. She said it clearly and without drama, and then she closed the file in front of her and moved on to whatever came next on her docket, which I thought was exactly right. There was no drama in that room. There was a ruling and a correction, and then the world continued. My father and I had lunch afterward at Luther's. He ordered the fried shrimp plate again. He ate most of it again. He did not say much during the meal, but when we were leaving, he stopped on the sidewalk outside and he put his hand on my shoulder for a moment, which was more than he usually did physically because he was not a demonstrative man. He said, "You didn't have to do all this." I said, "Yes, I did." He said, "It's been a long time since someone looked out for me like that." I did not say what I was thinking, which was that someone should have been looking out for him all along, and that someone was me, and I had been looking out for him in the ways I knew and missing the ways I did not know yet, and that this whole year had been an education in the difference between those two categories. I said, "Let's go home, Daddy." He said, "All right." We drove back to Moss Creek Lane in separate cars. I followed him. He drove the way he always drives, within the speed limit, full stop at stop signs, right blinker on well in advance of the turn. I watched his brake lights and his blinker on the road ahead of me, and I thought about all the times I had watched his car from behind on this same road, from childhood to now, and how the car had changed, but the way he drove had not. The marsh was doing what it does in November, going golden brown, all the Spartina grass in its autumn color, the creeks reflecting the gray sky. There is a particular quality to the low country in fall that I do not know how to describe to someone who has not stood in it. It is the quality of something that has been there longer than you have and will be there after you are gone, not indifferent exactly, but patient. Patient in a way that is bigger than anything you are going through at any given moment. I pulled into my father's driveway behind him. We went inside. He put on coffee. I sat at the kitchen table and looked out at the dock, and Gerald was there. My father said, "That bird knows something." I said, "What does he know?" My father said, "He knows to come back." He said it like it was simple, and I suppose it is simple. You come back, you stand where you have stood before, you stay as long as you need to stay, and then you come back again. That is the story I have been trying to tell you. Not the legal part, though the legal part is what made it possible to tell. Not the evidence, though the evidence is what made the legal part possible. The story underneath all of that, the one I keep coming back to, is a woman standing at an open filing cabinet drawer in April and deciding not to say anything yet, and a man hiding a note in the back of a desk drawer in July and hoping his daughter would find it. And the 8 weeks between those two things, when neither of us knew quite what we knew, and we were both paying attention in the ways we knew how. And it was enough, finally, by the smallest possible margin, just barely enough. I drove back to Columbia that November evening, and I stopped at a gas station outside of Orangeburg, and I filled the tank, and I got a bad cup of coffee from inside, and I stood next to my car in the cold, and I thought about nothing in particular for a few minutes. Just the highway and the dark and the coffee and the particular feeling of having finished something that took longer than you thought it would. The original 1989 deed was in my laptop bag in the back seat. I had been carrying it for 3 months. The next day, I would take it to my office and file it properly with the rest of the documents and close out the case file I had been building since August. But that night, it was in the bag, and I was in a parking lot in Orangeburg, and there was nothing else to do but get back in the car and drive the last hour home. So that is what I did. There is one more thing I keep meaning to say and then not saying, and I am going to say it now before this is over. The morning after the court ruling, I drove back to Beaufort one more time. My father did not know I was coming. I let myself in with my key, and I made coffee in his kitchen, and I sat at the table and I waited for him to wake up. He came downstairs at 7:15 the way he always does, in his robe and slippers, and he was not surprised to find me there. He just said, "Did you sleep over?" And I said no, I drove back this morning. He nodded and got himself a cup of coffee and sat across from me, and we did not say anything for a few minutes, the way you can be silent with someone you have known your whole life and not feel the need to fill it. At some point I said, "Daddy, when did you write the note, the one in the drawer?" He thought about it. He looked out the window at the marsh, which in early November morning was flat and silver. He said he thought it was a Sunday because he had been sitting at his desk after he got home from church, which he did most Sundays when the weather was too cold for the porch, and he had found the deed on the floor near the filing cabinet, and he had held it for a while, and he had known something was wrong, and he had sat down and written the note. I said, "Why didn't you call me?" He said he did not know what to say. He said he did not have the words for it that would not sound like an accusation of his own daughter, and he was not ready to do that yet. And so he wrote the note and he put it in the drawer, and he thought maybe he would know the words by the next time I came down, and maybe he did not need to say them himself if I found the note. He said it without apology. He said it like a man describing a decision he had made and still stood by, even knowing how it had unfolded. I said, "You could have called me." He said, "I know, I will next time." I said there is not going to be a next time. He said that's what you think now. And he was smiling a little, the way he does when he is saying something he finds both true and slightly uncomfortable. And I wanted to argue with him, but I also thought he was probably not entirely wrong. That there would be other things, that there are always other things, that the work of paying attention to the people you love is never actually finished, it just changes. Zable. I refilled his coffee. He said thank you. We sat there until the sun came far enough up over the marsh to come in through the kitchen window and put some warmth on the table between us. I said I need to go back to Colombia. He said I know. I said I'll call Sunday. He said I know that too. He walked me to the door. He said, Nora. I said yes. He said, you always paid attention. I said, so did you? And he looked at me for a moment with that particular look he has, the look of a man who has something to say and is deciding whether to say it. And then he said, your grandmother would have liked how you handled this. He said she always said you had her instincts. My grandmother on my father's side had been a legal secretary for 22 years. I had not known that until I was in college. I thought of her as my grandmother, not as a person with a professional history, the way children think of grandparents. When I found out about her work life, she said she had loved the exactness of it. She said there was a specific satisfaction in watching something that was wrong get corrected in writing, something official, something that could not be argued with afterward. She said the paper was always the thing, the paper was where the truth lived. I thought about her in the car on the way back to Columbia. I thought about her sitting at a desk somewhere in Beaufort in the 1960s, a woman who understood how paper worked and what it meant and how to read it, and about my father growing up watching her go to work every morning and coming home with the smell of carbon paper on her hands. And I thought about the fact that I had gone into title work without quite knowing why, except that it felt right, except that I was good at it, except that there was something satisfying about the paper, about the chain of documents that told the story of a piece of land from the beginning to now, about being the person who could read that chain and see what it said and what it was not saying. My grandmother had left me a small writing desk in her will, dark wood, brass pulls on the drawers. It sits in my home office in Columbia. I work at it sometimes on evenings when I have something to do that does not require a screen. Becca uses it too for her homework when she wants somewhere quieter than the kitchen table. I had not thought about where that desk came from in a long time. I thought about it the whole drive home. Lid is a thing I try to remember now when I am in the middle of something that feels overwhelming and slow, when the evidence is building but nothing has resolved yet and the days are passing in that particular way that long, slow situations make them pass, patient and relentless and not caring at all about your timetable. I try to remember that paying attention has a history, that it was given to me by women who understood before I did what it was worth. That the instinct to look at a document and know when something is wrong is not just a professional skill. It is something older than my profession, older than my career, older than the specific Tuesday in 2005 when I sat down for the first time at a title company and began to learn the vocabulary of it. It was handed to me across a writing desk, and I am handing it to Becca across the same desk every evening she sits there whether she knows it yet or not. My name is Nora Elaine Calloway. I am 38 years old, and there is a land deed in Beaufort County, South Carolina, recorded correctly in my father's name, and a writing desk in Columbia, and a heron on a dock who comes back every morning, and an empty manila folder that my father still has on his study desk because he said it gave him a sense of order, and he is not wrong. That is the whole truth of it, all of it this time.